You just run this?
Yeah, you can.
Sure. You asked me to be a discussant. I'm not sure what it implies.
I think you invent.
Yeah, but anyways, I kind of course, listening to you, and also I had the opportunity to read the text. I think that's a really good concept that you actually, get sort of these drafts and get to respond to them, and I think it's useful for me also listening to you. But great papers, I think, and this sort of interest in how technology uses us and how to conceptualize the agency of technology, understand it, or come to terms with it, how to exist with technology, and sort of not how to quantify the self, but how to be a self in the presence of quantification. I think these are, really important questions. In as much as it is a story of ourselves that we see in the data, it's also sort of a writing that produces us. And I think that sort of dichotomy is really interesting. And I was thinking of, it's spot on, but I was also thinking of how to interpreting what you say, how to conceptualize this in a larger perspective. And I was thinking of, you mentioned, Jill, this sort of paper and writing as kind of that's when technology was more easy. It didn't sort of project us back, but I was thinking that maybe paper and writing do that. And maybe that's a sign of something bigger. I was thinking of Jacques Derrida, who writes about the grammatology, that writing is an externalization of consciousness. And this externalization is what also creates us as human beings. You can contrast this to speech, that's normally perceived as closer to the soul. And also, then writing is can you hear me? Then
do you want to
for the video.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And I was thinking also in a larger perspective, not writing, but Giorgio Agamben talks in continuation of Foucault about the dispositif or the apparatus. It's literally anything that in some way has the capacity to capture, or determine, or model, or control. And he uses also the example of the pen writing literature, but also extends this to agriculture and computers and cell phones, and why not language itself, he says. So to him, subjectivity is what appears in between the living and the apparatus. I think that's very similar to the way you think of it. So at the very fundamental level, language and writing and these apparatuses are not neutral, but have their own realities. And these realities affect how we understand and construct ourselves, I think. I think you both point to this very nicely. How these systems of quantification functions as apparatuses or dispositives would be the. I also see this in other studies of software. I was thinking first, like sticking to the grammar of Phil Agra, who talks about grammars of action, and how systems like computers capture data. That's what they capture. They don't surveil us, but they capture us, and that changes our behaviors changes our grammars of actions into becoming visible for capture. Being at a university, it's quite obvious, how research and education, etc., is constantly the object of capture. But also Matthew Fuller in software studies, who talks about word. I was thinking of that because of your text, Jill, but he says, well, word is not only a tool for writing, it also designs its users. A particular way of writing particular global business like English, for instance. I have lots of other things to discuss. But maybe we should start here. Yeah.
Well, I'm just sort of thinking, yes. Tell me more.
What, do you have
Okay.
specific-
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, well, many interesting suggestions. Really. There is one thing that I actually grabbed from your presentation that I think was quite interesting and connects to something I've been writing about, but I couldn't really discuss in this presentation. I only briefly mentioned it at the very end, and it's the use of the transitive verbs in the description of how we engage with the quantified self and with technologies in general. So the idea of humans using technology, so a subject using an object. And my suggestion at the end of living with, as things to live with, is also an attempt to try to think in terms of intransitive verbs. So can we think about technologies as things we cohabit with, that we dwell on? So can we think in terms of coexistence rather than usage and influence, verbs that all imply a transition and an action upon an object or a subject. So that's because I very often notice that, particularly in relation to quantified self and gamification, the stories that we hear are mostly about the effects of, and also about agency, for example, which implies a transitive verb. So it implies an action to be that happens on someone or something. But maybe the trick is in the verbs that we use. So thinking instead of cohabitation or living together or mutual influence. I've also been, for example, thinking about these technologies as parasites. So can we think of the quantified self, for example, of Nike Fuel as a parasite, or ourselves as parasites of these technologies? So in terms of co-living and mutual cohabitation rather than using each other. That's one more idea.
Yeah, well, I think there's certainly a greater and greater level of equality balance between us and our technology. I mean, you can argue whether we have any agency left or not, but it's certainly quite clear that there's some sort of shared thing going on here anyway. And I do think it's really interesting thinking about how we're trying to imbue our technologies with subjectivity through artificial intelligence and stuff at the same time as we're trying to quantify ourselves. Like there's this immensely complex and interesting back and forwards happening there.
Yeah. Yeah, but obviously, I mean, that also points to what you were sort of alluding at towards the end, the sort of whole discussion of posthumanism. And I was also thinking of that, reading your paper of Karen Barad's thinking, not that I'm so, I mean, some people really quote her a lot. I don't do that, but I find it interesting. But she also picks up actually on Foucault's notion of the apparatus or dispositif to understand as a way of sort of explaining what she calls sort of this agential realism and interactions between humans and technologies. I think that maybe there's something to be gained, in her thinking, and it's sort of that that sort of must encourage us to think of these apparatuses as involving processes that are both technical and human at the same time. And if you are to understand them, we also need to not only look at them as, extensions of human activity, but also as extensions of machine activity. Yes. And that how these machine activities are and I quote philosophers all the time. Deleuze and Foucault writes that machines are social, are human technologies before they are technical ones. So actually, when we look at this, it sort of involves different steps, right? We have first, we shouldn't see this as just an extension of our own activity. We should look at the technical processes involved, but behind the technical processes, there are ideologies. I mean, I couldn't imagine the quantified self without also thinking. I think that's the topic of the next discussion after this session. The neoliberal subject, the construction of a neoliberal subject. I mean, just as much as the prison constructs a different subject or whatever in Foucault's thinking. So I think there's something to be gained in this kind of thinking.
I'm just wondering though, because I mean, yes, I absolutely agree that the neoliberal, which we are going to return to, hugely important. But there are other examples of self-tracking, like women have, I'm sure, always tracked their periods to some extent. Oh well, all right then. And or you know, I have a friend who, I did the baby tracking on the computer, but I have a friend who does that on paper, and she learned it from her mother. So, and these are forms of, I mean, you can trace some of that back to the sort of numerical bias in medicine, the way that women's care for children was like transitioned from midwives to doctors, and it became more objective and more data and more machines, and measure the baby, don't just look at the baby and feel it to see if it's healthy, but measure it, weigh it. And I think that's different from neoliberalism. Right? I mean, maybe that you can certainly say they're related, which makes me think that perhaps quantified self could have, I mean, now it's clearly very neoliberal, a lot of it, but maybe it could have been different, and that's interesting to think about. Brecht suggested that why did we make radio broadcast? Why didn't we make it a peer-to-peer, like a two-way medium? I mean, he said that in the 30s, and it's quite true. We could have made the technology different. So is there a way we could think about quantified self as not neoliberal?
Yeah, of course. I mean, the quantification. I mean, in the Roman Empire, they were obsessed with the quantifying stocks and state. I mean, I mean, it's as old as writing, right? Keeping track of stuff. But I think then this sort of construction of the subject. I mean, we should also. I mean, now we are engaging the other panel, but also, I mean, how that's different from, say, the consuming subject in the consumer society, as Lefebvre described it. There's a control of consumption. So, for instance, to become, I mean, objects don't just have like a use value, they also have a sign value. So a car, for instance, is not just a car, it's also a particular brand that expresses a particular kind of power and authority. And the implication of this is that if I don't have a car, I don't have that authority. And if I have a particular car, I have a particular kind of authority. And think that's sort of how capitalism functions in his perspective. But I think with the quantified self, it's different. It doesn't want me to consume. It doesn't want me to obey, to become a particular kind of person. It just wants to measure me. And it sort of thrives on the data that I leave. That's the value that's gained. So it's a subject that's encouraged to share, and who only comes into being by sharing, by being visible. That would be my thesis. Yeah.
Maybe if I can also add one thing. So connected to what you were saying before about this connection with the neoliberal ideology, I think the point here is really to try to understand when we talk about the knowledge that is offered by the quantified self, what specific kind of knowledge are we talking about? And that's, I think it's really the question. So when you, for example, were presenting the work by James Bridle, which is a brilliant work where he presents how Google, right? How Google track its, how his smartphone, how his iPhone actually track his movement, and this idea of not remembering all the places where he has been. Which, of course, brings to the conclusion that, okay, my phone knows more about me than I do. But then, of course, this knowledge that we are talking about, it's a quantified knowledge. It's a knowledge that can be measured in terms of more or less. Which kind of reminded me of when I was presenting and talking about these differences by degree and differences in kind. So it's a specific kind of knowledge that it can be quantified and therefore can be different by quantity. So I can say that, for example, my phone knows more about me than I do. But it is also of a different, there are also knowledges of different qualities, of different kind. So I think the question about the quantified self-technology, if we want to somehow think and invent other narratives, other stories about the quantified self, is to think how many other knowledges there can be, how many other knowledges we can imagine and present and discuss and create narratives about. I think that's really the challenge at this stage.
Some time for the
for the audience.
Questions as well.
Yeah.
There's a mic here. So maybe you can keep that on. Does anybody have any questions to the panel? Yes, Phoebe. I'm going to do more steps today as a result of this. Very good. Somebody should quantify that for me.
Hi, I'm Phoebe Moore. Thanks again. Excellent papers. Really, really interesting. I think what occurred to me in your discussion is what's missing from the conversation is something about method and what we rely on when we talk about quantification of activity and life is the fact that we're looking at something that's longitudinal. So that's something that's facilitated actually by the new technologies of sensory tracking. That's something that's missing in your discussion of what brings out the quality of the knowledge and the data itself. And then in terms of Bergson, I just wanted to pick up on something that he talked about that I think helps us to tease out how we can be critical of this, or how we can think carefully about how this new form of knowledge, whether it's helpful or not. And it's his point that, in fact, what we're talking about, once you start to datify, once you have this concept, I think you have to talk datism, which I think is something that sort of brings about this conceptualization that there can be a neutral understanding, something that's objectifiable in some kind of way, is that each unit of measure is equal to every other unit of measure, which what I think happens when you begin to bring out the longitudinal dimension of how this looks over a period of time, which again is facilitated by the new technologies, it allows us to then make subjective interpretations from that data. So it doesn't, I would argue, at this stage, unless we talk about it critically as though it's something that's part of a bigger political economic kind of shift and what that means. So that's one of the big questions that I continue to look at. But fantastic, and that's not really a question, it's just something I think that's been missing so far.
Thanks very much.
Can I add something? Because I think that the first thing you raised, like the method, maybe not a method, but that's something you actually address more explicitly actually in your written paper that some of us has read. This sort of, you allude to artistic practice. I mean, you give examples of artists who sort of propose a different kind of engagement, and I know you also have a practice. Yeah, so I think that's, I mean, is that a sort of a way of sort of understanding this gaze on us?
I think art is one of the best places to look to see how, critiques of this, and there's so much interesting stuff happening in the art world, critiquing exactly this sort of technology, but also like the example with Rodin's critique of the photography. Often, I think art is such a different way of portraying or seeing the world than this, which is trying to be so objective that it provides a really interesting alternative viewpoint. At the same time, as every time you look at some quantified thing, some artist has already done it. I mean, it's astounding. Like, okay, one of the silliest sort of quantified self things I saw recently was on Quickstarter. It's a fart monitor. You clip it in your back pocket, and and it measures your gaseous emissions, and it and then you also enter what you eat and so forth, and it tracks your activity, and then it gives you an analysis saying how to reduce gas for you, personalized. It didn't actually get funded, but and that was like 2 years ago. But like I think about 5, maybe 10 years ago, Ellie Harrison, an artist, did that. She tracked her farts for a year, and she made I think it's a Birmingham railway station. There's one of those little borders on the glass windows there that just looks like some random decoration, but it's actually a graph of her farts. And Beckett wrote about that in Malloy. Malloy counts his farts. I mean, so in this case, art has predicted and critiqued, well, a failed quantified self thing a long time ago. So absolutely look at art. Kind
of trying to reconnect to the question comment. So in terms of methods, I think we are kind of we will always be in a dead end as long as we try to measure different things or to think about different units of measurement. So what I'm thinking about is mostly imagining different, really quite literally different words to be used to talk about what we do with our quantified selves. Different narratives, different stories, and that's exactly what artists do. So I agree with that. So there are many examples of new media artists who are currently engaging with quantified self technologies and gamification. And what they're ultimately proposing is essentially different ways of making sense of what do we really do. And very often the move is, as I did really, is to focus on the personal, intimate story of how a singular individual engages with these technologies. I guess this is probably a move to somehow counter these generalized universal narratives on the quantified self. And it's also, of course, a method to say something different and probably also to escape from an otherwise strangling end of the quantified self.
Hi, thanks. They were great papers. Really enjoyed them. I just pick up on something that the discussion just started with, realities. And I think, to some degree, I think it's really important, the realities of all this. And Paolo, you said, my phone knows more about me than I do. It doesn't. It just collects the information. It doesn't know about you. So, but bring it back to the two talks. It's like, in yours particularly, Jill, what really struck me, particularly with the diaries and also the discussion of Eliza, is therapy. People are using these things as therapy. And we had a discussion last night. We were talking about, there was a Guardian article a while ago about this woman who was on a forum, a health forum, and she was posing as a cancer sufferer, and she wasn't, and she was enjoying the kind of adulation and the support she was getting through it. And I'm just wondering about therapy, and for you, Paolo, the intuition. I thought that you briefly touched upon it, and I thought that was a really interesting thing. And what was it about the phone? Say the Fitband, the Nike Fuel, that what intuition there suddenly went, oh, hold on, the time zones are different. It's over. It's finished. It's coming to an end. Just interested in that kind of aspect of it.
Yeah, actually, it's interesting that the technical fault that the Nike Fuel had was related to the moving between time zones, because in the end, the problem that I had with Nike Fuel, it was all about time and the timing of my tracking, and how it was not changing in quality over time. So in a sense, it's the story of my engagement with Nike Fuel and the failure of it and the end of it. It's all about time. But it's also my consideration of breaking up with Nike Fuel, as I say, was also about introducing the problem of time into my understanding of time and change, of course, and movement in my understanding of my engagement with Nike Fuel. So yeah, so that was my take. I think the issue of duration it's quite crucial, and also which connects to the idea of the event. So is it possible to imagine an event happening in these relationships that we have with our quantified selves? Or are they kind of somehow condemned to remain static and always repeating themselves according to the same criteria? So how can event happen in this engagement? I think, for example, the idea of the Dear Diary that you mentioned, it's quite interesting, because it brings to a different kind of connection of making sense of the relationship. In the Dear Diary, this connection is always already there, and in particular, I think with Nike Fuel, what I realized at one point, that it was almost impossible to tell when was a good time to stop using it, because if it is always the same, so you can always go on for one more day, right? So you can always accumulate, you can always do +1. So how do we decide when we stop using these self-tracking technologies? Actually, I would be very interested, and I'm not sure if it has been done so far, but hearing some interviews of people who stopped using these technologies. And maybe they didn't necessarily make sense, nothing particularly drastic happened, but how do we make sense of the decision of stepping back and stop this continuous and repetitive and homogeneous tracking of ourselves, which would be a way of introducing the event and the issue of time in the ways in which we make sense of quantified self.
That would be a great study. Philippe Lejeune wrote an article. He's like the great scholar of diaries. He wrote an article about how diaries end, which is kind of fascinating. He has like 4 types. I can't remember them all. One is obviously death, right? One is that somebody finds the diary who really shouldn't have, and there are a few others. But it's a really interesting question. Yeah.
Okay, well, I suggest that we stop the panel here. Thank you so much for all the excellent discussion.